What if it takes 30 years?
It's the long game, not the short game.
We're putting ourselves into a winning endeavor.
There's stuff that has to happen before you sow the seed.
That could be really discouraging, actually.
Most people come to Christ through people who don't think they're very good at evangelism.
Okay, well, if it's all up to God, then what's my part?
You might have to abandon your agenda and trust God's.
This week on the Reach Podcast. All right, we're back. It is week 2 of the Reach Podcast, and we're doing our mini-series on the 1, 2, 3 model of relational evangelism. Now, last week we covered part 1. That was under Value the One. Today, we're covering the 2, and next week it'll be the 3. We're excited to be able to share these things with you. They're really, really cool and helpful. I hope you found last week's episode helpful. Joined, as always, by Dr. John Hopper. He is the Executive Director of Reach, and Don Barkley, who is Search's Director of Staff Training. And so, guys, thank you again for being back here. Don, I'm going to throw it to you, because what I'd like you to do is give us the 30-second overview of the 1, 2, 3. What's the 1, 2, 3 stand for?
So 1, 2, 3, each of the numbers stands for something. So the 1 stands for one thing, 2 stands for 2 things, and 3 stands for 3 things.
Wow, that's insightful.
Can you remember that?
I got it.
So the 1 stands for the idea that God values the one, therefore we should value the one individual. The 2 stands for 2 principles, that evangelism is a process, or that somebody's spiritual journey is a process. And the second principle, that God is responsible for the result. The 3 stand for 3 barriers that keep a person from coming to faith. An intellectual barrier, an emotional barrier, and a spiritual barrier. That's what the 1, 2, 3 stand for.
I love it. It's great. And I would encourage everybody listening, try to just remember that if you can. It's really simple. That's why we called it the 1, 2, 3. Make it easy to remember. Not as easy to do, but it is easy to remember. So yeah, hopefully by the time we're done with this, it'll just sink in a little bit. Okay, so today's episode is on the 2 principles. And John, I'm going to throw it to you to kind of help talk us through the very first principle, that somebody's spiritual journey is a process. What do we mean by that? And what's the biblical support for it?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think a lot of times we can think about, okay, someone doesn't really know anything about Christ. We tell them about Christ, and then maybe they, receive Jesus as their Savior, right? So, but that's generally not the case, right? So there's often many touch points that are necessary for someone to come to faith. So it might be events in their life. It might be people who have talked to them. It might be that they were invited to certain things. It might be that they caught something on, a podcast or on TV or something like that. But there might be all kinds of things that led them to that place where they understood who Jesus is and gave his life to him. And so we have to recognize that when we enter into this heart and journey of leading people to Christ. That it's not necessarily going to be this point in time decision where I've got them in a corner, I'm sitting them down, I'm telling them about Jesus, this is it. So that could be really discouraging, actually, right? If we take that posture, because most of the time people won't on the spot, give their life to Jesus. We're just adding sort of, one more bit of information, one more perspective, one more voice that can be a part of their journey and their process of coming to the Lord.
Yeah, and so where do we get this principle from? Where does it come from?
Well, I think one of the places that we can see it most clearly is in John chapter 4. And in John 4, Jesus is interacting with this woman, a Samaritan woman, a woman who had been married a number of times before, was living with this other man. I mean, she would be someone that you would think sort of a holy rabbi like Jesus wouldn't even spend time with. And he has this long conversation with this woman, and he's having this conversation without his disciples, but then his disciples show up afterward, right? And they're kind of curious because I think as they're approaching Jesus, they're seeing that he's talking with this, Samaritan woman with a past, right? So Jesus says some words to them that I think really help us to see that evangelism is a process. He says, I tell you, open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest. That's a famous verse for people pushing evangelism, right? Like, look out there, like everything, all the fields are ripe for harvest. And I'm not so sure that Jesus was saying that every field is ripe for harvest, but that one was, as we even go on in the passage, that many from this village of this woman end up following Jesus here. But the reason that Jesus says that harvest was ripe is he says this. He says to his disciples that you're about to reap what you haven't sown. He says the others have done the hard work, and you're about to reap the benefits of their labor. So that means that there have been people that had come even before Jesus was there and were dropping information about Jesus or about God or about the scriptures or about worship. And as a result, when Jesus came, there was a readiness at that point in time, but only because there was this process. And in fact, if you look back at the conversation that Jesus had with the woman, she already knew a lot of things before Jesus got there. She knew there were prophets. She knew there was a Messiah that would come. She knew that there was worship that was to be had. So she wasn't a blank slate, right? There were other people who had come. And so sometimes we get to be the person at the end, right? like Jesus was, or the disciples were. But sometimes we're just a part of people's journey along the way. And when we have that view of evangelism, we can see evangelism not just as closing the deal, but as anything that moves people one step closer to seeing who Jesus is.
It's so helpful, John, because I know so many people that think of sharing your faith or doing evangelism, being involved in the Great Commission, however you want to say it, is only the moment when you get the opportunity to tell somebody the gospel. And of course it includes that. But if you think it's only that, you might live most of your life highly discouraged, or you might be somebody who is maybe doing more harm than good if that's all you're doing. Every interaction, you go right to the gospel. That might not be as effective either. So, Don, I'm going to turn to you. And do you have a story? You've been doing ministry with Search since 1984. Can you give us a little story that illustrates this principle that somebody's spiritual journey is a process? Is there somebody that comes to mind?
Of course. I mean, there are several somebodies. And this principle, along with a second, but especially this first principle, kind of kept me hopeful and kept me involved in the person's life.
Okay.
One guy was the gardener next door. And we got talking to him. I got talking to him out in the front yard, and he shared how his sister had become a Mormon, and he was intrigued by what Mormonism was. So that got him thinking about religious things, and he started asking me questions about hell and whatever. I started to meet with him every week. And there was really no sign of any kind of change or growth. He is very smart, and he was curious kind of about some things, but he didn't show any sign of moving the needle or trusting in the Lord. But I kept meeting with him. So I really didn't see results. And I didn't see really any progress. But I knew that God values the one person, and that it's a process. And because it's a process, I can't measure my success by taking a snapshot of where that person is right now. Like John said, there's a continuum, and my friend, the Dutch gardener is what he went by, was down the scale a ways. And he wasn't ready to hear about the gospel or about Jesus. He was ready just to talk to somebody about spiritual things, because he was now interested in spiritual things because of his sister.
Yeah. That's a great illustration. And, there's so many ways that I think people can apply this, especially if it's just a mindset of knowing, hey, I'm involved in the mission that God has. If I'm just intentional with one person and I'm helping them take a step, and I see myself as part of a bigger process that's going on.
For people into gardening or for those in the farming community understand this, they don't say, I'm not a successful farmer because it's not harvest time. No, they're a successful farmer because they're doing what's necessary to prepare for the harvest. And there is stuff that has to happen before you sow the seed. Preparing the soil and weeding and pesticides and all that sort of stuff, waiting on the weather, waiting on the timing. And you can't reach down to that little seedling under the soil and give it a yank and give it a gentle pull to hurry up the process. And it's amazing how many times Jesus uses this agricultural motif to talk about sharing our faith.
Yeah. Hey, everybody, I wanted to take a moment and let you know that the Reach podcast is brought to you by Search, a ministry dedicated to sharing Jesus through friendships and conversations for nearly 50 years. Learn more or get involved at searchnational.org.
I got another great story I got to share before we move on. So this was just a couple months ago. I'm walking out of a Costco, and I see this woman that I've known for many years, and I just kind of run to catch up with her. And she immediately says to me, because she knows my interest and my heart, she says, you know, I try to do the things that you do, but I just don't know that I do them all that well. And then she starts to tell me this story. She's involved with these English as a second language classes. And she said, there's this Iranian woman that I just really had a heart for, and so I just, spent a lot of time with her and helping her with her English, and I tried to share with her about Jesus, but she just seemed to never really understand what I said. And but she would always say, I love Christians. They're always so nice and they're so kind. Well, eventually this Iranian pastor kind of gets into the circle of my friend, and she introduces the Iranian pastor to this Iranian woman. And the woman on the spot receives Jesus. Okay? So the question is, did she receive Jesus because of the message of the Iranian pastor, or because of the many, many months of kindness that preceded the message? That's right. And I would say it's a both and, right? So she would not have been open to the message without the love. That was a huge part of the process, right? So, but she also needed someone who spoke her language who could clearly articulate it, right? So, so how great there, right? So that woman who was sharing the story, she was like, I don't really do much. Oh, she was doing a lot. She was doing a ton. That was a part of the process of seeing that woman come to Christ.
Yeah, it's the whole point of what Jesus was saying there in John 4. So, no, that's a great story. Yeah. Thank you for interrupting and sharing it. Okay, I'm going to go back to Don over here. All right, so we're going to go to the second principle. We've talked about that a person's spiritual journey is a process. The second principle is that God's responsible for the results. So what do we mean by that? What are the results? And where does that principle come from?
Well, it comes from the Bible, and I'm going to share a place in a second.
Great place to get
but
biblical
the
principle.
Setup for that has been perfect in that this woman who was really successful at loving her friend felt like she wasn't a good evangelist. And I think, and I've said before that I think I don't think that's an exaggeration. Most people come to Christ through people who don't think they're very good at evangelism. Why? Because they've been part of the process. And it's not about their weakness, it's about God's strength. God's strength to work on the subterranean aspects of the harvest, in a person's whole heart and soul. What was going on inside that woman, or what was going on inside my gardener friend, who eventually opened up and accepted Christ and became a missionary to Mormon missionaries, by the way. But he was not reached because of me. God used me, but God worked on the inside of him to draw him to Christ. And that's a freeing principle. If you take the first principle, that it's a process, and add this one to it, I just feel my shoulders relaxing and taking a big, deep breath. So if God's responsible for the results, where does it come from? I think one good place, you'll find not only the second principle, but also the first principle, and that's in 1 Corinthians 3, where there's this squabble apparently in ancient Corinth based on which teacher, which pastor, which leader, evangelist you really favored. We could say, well, I'm really a C.S. Lewis fan. I don't, Tim Keller is mine. No, I'm a Charles Stanley guy. And that it sort of prevented unity and it presented division. And so Paul says, wait a minute. First of all, some of you who are following me, and some of you are following a very intelligent Alexandrian Jew named Apollos, he says, for when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered. That's the first principle. But here's the kicker. But God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. And that's true for a gardener or farmer too. I mean, we're not in charge of the photosynthesis process. We're not in charge of, how a cell multiplies and becomes a plant and produces fruit. We just are accompanying the Creator in seeing growth happen. And that's what we can do, is we can watch God work in people's lives in His timing, in His way. And so we don't have to push and we don't have to quit. Because if I know it's a process, and I know if God's responsible for the results, it's His agenda that I want to be submissive to, which means it may take months, weeks, even years for anybody to see the fruit. And I've been in relationships with people for 18, 20 years who came to Christ over a couple of decades of a process, watching other people work in their lives, watching God work in an interior way, to my surprise even. And that's what's cool, is you see, even they're surprised. I have a friend who just died last week, in fact, but came to Christ 20 years ago, came to Christ. And when he did, he was reading a book I had given him, because finally he was open to it. And he said, something was happening to me inside. Don, I don't know what's happening to me. Well, I told him what's happening. God is at work, because God is inclined to love you. He wants to love you, and He's the one powerful enough to draw you to Himself in His way, kindly, mercifully, gently, in a process. And to watch that happen, where it wasn't me, God really gets the credit, because God's responsible for the results.
Yeah, He's the only one that can do a heart change.
Yeah.
Right? And that's really the point. You could go to 100 other passages that teach something similar, right? This is not just found in one place. But John, I want to throw this question to you, because I can imagine some people out there listening to this going, okay, well, if it's all up to God, then what's my part? Is there a part? Of course, we've been talking about we have a part. How does that work?
Yeah.
It's a process. We're involved with God and His mission, but it's all up to Him. Help me out with that.
Yeah. So the results are up to God. In fact, I was thinking about it just in the last couple of days. The scriptures say that no one comes to Jesus unless the Father draws him, right? So, and we only know about God because He reveals Himself, right? And we're only saved because of His work on our behalf, right? Like He's done it all, sort of thing, right? So it makes sense that the results are up to Him. But then the question comes about, like, well, do I have to do anything then, right? Like I just sit on my hands. I mean, if the results are up to God, but God is gracious enough to use us as His means many times. So to allow us to be a reflection of who He is, to be ambassadors for Him, to be a part of His drawing process, or to be a part of His revealing process, or to be a part of sort of explaining sort of the salvation work of Jesus. So He's given us that chance to enter into it. Now here's the really cool thing is, because the results are up to God, and we see in Scripture that God's going to get results. Like there's going to be people from every nation, tribe, and language and tongue before His throne. That when we put our efforts in, we're guaranteed a return. Like we may not see that return all the time, and it might be many years, but we're putting ourselves into a winning endeavor. I mean, what a cool thing. Like if somebody said to you, hey, put your money into this investment, you're going to get 20% a year guaranteed. Like, I think I'd do it. I certainly, like, if it was a real deal, right? Like, God is guaranteeing success. He's saying people will come to him. And so even though the results are up to him, like, well, let's get on the train with that one. So, because it's going to work out well in the end.
Yeah. No, that's a great way of putting it, and I really appreciate it. And what would you encourage people, when they put this into practice, or like, how does this affect the way that they would do their, evangelistic work?
Yeah. I think when you look at both of those principles, it sort of goes to what Don was saying earlier. It just makes you relax. And I think why that's important is if we push the process too quickly, it actually can work against us. So if you going back to the agricultural motif, right? If you, I'm going to water the plants more so that they grow faster, right? Well, you can drown the darn plant, right? So it's not going to grow at all. It actually works against you. So sometimes in our eagerness, we can push too hard and push the process faster than people are ready for it. So I'll give you sort of one example. Let's say that you're sitting down with someone, you're having some good conversation about life, and some things about spiritual matters even come up. And it starts out pretty well, but you start to see the other person get a little bit fidgety or defensive, or they want to move on to another topic. If you just keep pressing in on that sort of issue, like, no, we're going to get back to the topic and we're going to talk about this, likely they will not want to get together with you again. Like, that will sort of stunt the growth at that point in time. And oftentimes you just have to back up and just say, and just sort of let the conversation go another direction if that's what they're ready for, or even apologize at times. Say, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to come off too pushy or whatever. I understand a lot of people have questions about this. And if you just sort of back down there, it allows that growth in the other person to continue at the speed with which they're kind of ready for at that point in time.
Yeah. No, that makes a whole lot of sense. Thank you. This has been really helpful, both of you, talking through the two principles. And Don, I'm going to throw this last question to you, but when everybody's listening to this, what do you want them to take away from this whole conversation? There's been lots of great insight and wisdom and nuggets and stuff, but what's the main point that you'd want people to walk away with?
I would say, if you have tended to think of sharing your faith as an event with this particular result, a person coming to Christ, then you will be frustrated. You will be frustrated because you don't see it as a process as God sees it. And so I'd say, ask God to reorient your thinking about what this endeavor looks like, that it's the long game, not the short game, and that we're relying on God more than our technique or even our answers or even the truth we know. Because until they're hungry for the truth, sharing it is like feeding a person who doesn't want to eat. And so we trust God. So we lay aside our agenda for the process and we say, God, help me follow you in it with your timing and with your power.
Yeah, that's great, Don. Thank you very much. Thank you both for being here. And thank you all for listening. And we're going to be back next week with part 3 of this mini-series. You don't want to miss it. Thanks for listening to the Reach Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. That'd be a good idea. Share it with a friend and leave us a review to help others find the podcast. Now, for more resources, please visit reachothers.org and follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we'd love to hear from you.